Hey everybody, welcome to this spooky and haunted episode of Get Out and Explore with John. The building that you see behind me was built in 1858 here in Weston, West Virginia. It is simply known as the Trans Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. When it was first constructed, it was meant to be a mental hospital, but over its next 140 years of existence turned into something very sinister and evil. We're getting ready to go explore the Trans Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. Come with me if you dare. As I once heard in the song, you can check in anytime you like, but you can never check out. Here in this gallery, we see some of the artwork produced by some of the patients here, as this was part of the art therapy program at the hospital. This, along with theatrical performances, were part of the hospital's culture, and some patients reflected fondly on their experiences. Located in the small town of Weston, the former hospital tells an incredible story about the history of mental illness in the United States. The Trans Allegheny Lunatic Asylum wasn't always a nightmarish facility. In fact, when construction began in the 1850s, the concept behind the institution was revolutionary, as it was meant to be a sharp departure from other institutions of the time. A place of peace and restoration, and at first it seemed as these plans for moral treatment were working, but it soon devolved into madness and mayhem. And it is said that some of the spirits of the tormented patients allegedly still roam the halls today. The building was the brainchild of Thomas Kincaid, a physician and crusader for the mentally ill who founded what would eventually become the American Psychiatric Association. Kirkbride built on the foundation established by famous reformer Dorothea Dix, who sought to re-educate people about the misconceptions of mental illness, namely, that it was a shadowy, irreversible condition best treated in darkness with force and physical restraint. Kirkbride followed up this comment by emphasizing the importance of light and fresh air. He suggested that the asylums be designed with open halls, high ceilings, plenty of windows and ventilation that allowed for cross breezes. He also emphasized freedom. Patients suffering from mental illness, he felt, should be allowed to roam as much as possible and find stimulation for their minds. They would behave better, not worse, if given more control over their own lives. The construction of the building itself began in 1858, but was interrupted several times during its construction, which finally was completed in 1881. The construction was interrupted by the outbreak of the American Civil War in 1861. While construction was attempted during the war, the grounds and buildings were often occupied by both Union and Confederate forces, and building supplies were taken by Confederate raiders. It was finally opened to patients in 1864. Following the admission of West Virginia into the Union in 1863, the facility was renamed the West Virginia State Hospital for the Insane. Its name changed again in 1913 to the Weston State Hospital. The asylum, which sits on over 600 acres, was originally designed by architect Richard Snowden Andrews of Baltimore, Maryland, with the intent of being a self-sufficient state-of-the-art facility, as it had its own working farm, dairy production, and waterworks designed to make the patients feel more at home. It also contained its own cemetery on the grounds. Originally built for 240 patients to be housed in solitude, unfortunately at its peak in the 1950s, the building held over 2,400 mentally ill patients in overcrowded and generally deplorable conditions. Thankfully, the changes in the treatment of mentally ill patients and the physical deterioration of the building itself forced its closure in 1994. In addition to the transfer of the patients, this also had a devastating effect on the local economy, from which it still has yet to recover. The building is the largest hand-cut stone masonry building in North America and is the second largest in the world, with only the Kremlin in Moscow being larger. The 200-foot central clock tower was completed in 1871. Built according to the Kirkbride plan in both the Gothic Revival and Tudor Revival styles by the skilled masons from Ireland, Scotland, and Germany, crafted the blue sandstone from the local West Virginia countryside, with long corridors and large windows so that they would only see the rolling hills and openness, nothing that would suggest that the hospital was surrounded by gates to keep them locked inside. As to promote a calm and nurturing environment supportive of the people entrusted to its care. But life at the asylum didn't stay that way for long, as shortly after it opened, the numbers of patients began creeping above the building's capacity, with multiple beds crammed into rooms. As more and more people were admitted, the staff was forced to take actions to house patients. In the 1950s, when the population reached over 2,400, bed-sharing measures were implemented, which allowed patients 8 hours of rest before their beds were given to someone else. Patients at the hospital were of all ages and types, including long-term chronic patients, short-term crisis patients, court-ordered criminal patients, and those suffering from cyclical illnesses and reoccurring substance abuse. Some of the reasons for admittance to the Trans Allegheny Lunatic Asylum were quackery, jealousy, laziness, female diseases, religion, asthma, masturbation, greediness, imaginary female troubles, and bad habits, dementia, melancholy, politics, or even falling off a horse, just to name a few. Spouses were even allowed to use lunacy laws to rid themselves of their partners and in abducting their own children. While many people left the asylum under their own power, many died there. The staff notified the next of kin when a patient passed away. In many cases, families did not return to identify or take the bodies for burial, and some were just unable to afford burial, so they would have them buried at the hospital. Patients who were not claimed by their families were assigned a number and buried in the cemetery behind the hospital, with a simple gravestone with only their ID number. Over time, many of the gravestones were removed and repurposed, leaving virtually no way to identify the bodies buried at the asylum. Patients were always buried. They were never cremated. In 1949, the Charleston Gazette reported that the wallpaper was peeling from decay and that the patients were sleeping on rows of mattresses on the floor in unheated hallways. Patients that the orderlies were unable to control were placed in cages. By the 1930s, the hospital couldn't keep up. The patients were running wild, and the outnumbered orderlies struggled to gain control. In October of 1935, residents of the institution set fire to the 4th floor of the building, completely destroying it. Another time, 2 patients tried to hang another resident with bed sheets over the pipes in the ceiling. When that didn't work, they put his head under a metal bed frame and jumped on it until the frame touched the floor, killing him. The victim's ghost has been known to spend time in the room where he was killed. In yet another incident, a nurse went missing only to be found dead at the bottom of a seldom-used stairway. Asylum staff were empowered to chain patients to the walls or to send patients to isolation if they were uncontrollable, and even if they weren't. Some patients were kept in solitary confinement for days or even weeks at a time. Isolation was so detestable that one inmate in particular, a former boxer who suffered from injuries that rendered him emotionless and occasionally violent, attempted to beat down the metal door that closed behind him and was placed in a solitary cell. He ripped the door off its hinges and left visible dents in the other metal door. When the door was opened, he handed the nurse the destroyed door and calmly returned to his room. In the 1950s, the hospital became home to the West Virginia Lobotomy Project. Walter Freeman, the then famous physician, neurologist, and lobotomy advocate, took up residence in the hospital and led this effort. Though he had no formal surgical training, when performing lobotomies, he used an ice pick like an instrument and drove it through the patient's eye socket with a hammer, severing the connective tissue between the brain's prefrontal cortex. A showman by nature, he enjoyed performing lobotomies before live audiences, and at times shocking them by inserting 2 ice picks into each eye socket at the same time. At one point, he even allowed the media to watch him perform the procedure, which resulted in the patient's immediate death, to which he reacted indifferently and moved on to the next patient to try again. He would go on to perform over 2,900 of these procedures and became overzealous, performing 20 per day without the use of a surgeon. Over 490 of his patients died as a direct result of the lobotomy, and many of those who survived were crippled or lived in permanent vegetative states afterwards. Lobotomies were regularly used to treat mental disorders because they interrupted the neurological connections of the brain and the prefrontal cortex. Almost all patients who underwent the procedure were completely altered, often unable to provide even basic self-care, and many died during the procedure. Throughout the 1900s, the Charleston Gazette published several articles exposing the terrible conditions at the Trans Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. In 1949, the newspaper described the conditions at the asylum as that of looking like a hog pen, and that it smelled even worse. Controversial therapies, medications, and treatments altered the lives of patients, not always in a productive manner. In the 1950s, the facility saw the introduction of antipsychotic medications, such as Thorazine, which was used to treat psychotic disorders, but it was widely prescribed to keep the patients in a catatonic state. From that point on, little treatment was being offered to the patients other than new medications. Insulin shock therapy, which placed patients in comas, and electroconvulsive therapy or shock treatment were other treatments used by the staff. In the 1960s, the hospital suffered staff shortages where you might only have 2 nurse aides in charge of 65 patients at one time. By 1968, there was only 1 licensed nurse in the entire facility. Even as the patient numbers continued to be in the thousands, there was never more than 1 psychiatrist on staff at any time. During this time, there was also a large number of elderly patients due to their inability to afford nursing homes in the area. By the 1960s, the town of Weston had a big problem on its hands, as many of the patients that were released had nowhere to go and began roaming the streets of downtown Weston. In the 1970s, one of the biggest problems at the hospital was overprescription of medications. This was done on purpose to try and keep the patients easier to maintain for the staff. As other mental health care facilities opened in the area during the 1970s and 80s, the population at Western would see a steady decline until it finally closed in 1994 with only 224 patients. Due to the lack of state funding and the ability to do any follow-up care, many patients were relocated and incarcerated in the state's jails and prisons. Others were transported to the new Sharp Hospital, also in Weston, for treatment. By the time the asylum was closed, only one part of it had been expanded sufficiently to accommodate the demand, and that was its cemetery. In a building brimming with stories of torture, neglect, and desperation, it's no wonder tales of ghosts running amok are part of the lore of the Trans Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. The hospital offers overnight paranormal tours that provide the best chance for a visitor to encounter a ghost, though you don't need to visit after dark to feel like the spirit of one of its patients might be right in front of you. While skeptics deny paranormal rumors surrounding the facility, there is one thing that we can all agree on. The crumbling building serves as a reminder of a shameful past and an urgent call to do better in the future. Well, the tour just ended, so I'm going to try and find my way back outside of the building here. This place is huge, and you definitely have to have a guide with you, otherwise you would totally be lost. So I'll see if I can make my way out, and I'll give you a recap when I get outside. The Trans Allegheny Lunatic Asylum was added to the National Historic Register in 1990 and is listed as one of America's historic landmarks at risk in 1998. In 2007, the state auctioned off the hospital and 300 acres to private owners who fund and maintain the facility, having restored much of the Kirkbride building with the help of money collected by the daily tours, as it has become a thriving tourist attraction, averaging over 70,000 visitors per year. Alright guys, they're still looking for me, but I got out of here, so I got to get going. I hope you liked the video. This place is really cool, so if you're ever in the area, you definitely got to stop by. The building is awesome, the stories are awesome, but I got to get out of here, so like I always say, You never know what you're going to see when you get out and explore with John. Later.